Dear learners, I am Christina Georgy, your academic counselor for the course code BPCS 186 titled Managing Stress. As per the requests of our learners, this session will be recorded by me. Dear learners, in our previous session we discussed stress, its basic concepts in the unit titled An Introduction to Stress. Today we look at the various models of stress. So in this particular unit we look at fight or flight response, general adaptation syndromes or GAS, cognitive appraisal model, person-environment fit model, psychodynamic theory, genetic constitutional theory, and finally the diathesis stress model. Let's straight away move on to the various models of stress. First and foremost, fight or flight response. So in order to understand this model of stress, it is of great importance to know the word meanings of flight and fight. What do you mean by the term fight? You fight with your siblings or you fight for freedom. Whereas flight refers to moving away from a situation. That is running away. That is the reference here. So remember Cannon, he was the man who studied the relationship of stress in animals and humans in the very first section that we discussed. Yes. So according to Cannon, stress is the outcome of an environmental demand that was external and that led to an imbalance in natural steady state of an individual. So he also stated that body encompasses natural defense mechanisms that play a role in maintaining the homeostasis or the natural steady state of an individual. Please remember the person who put forth this idea, that is Cannon. So he mentions that when an individual faces a situation that is threatening, he or she can respond in two ways, namely, one, he can fight or rather he can fly. That is, either he can face the situation, that is fight for the situation, or else he can run away from the situation. He or she will either get ready to fight the threat or may flight or run away from the situation. For example, if you see a snake, almost every one of us might be scared of snake, right? So suddenly if a snake comes into attack or we see a snake, some of us would be bold enough to fight the snake, but the majority of us or some of us would naturally run away from the snake. So running away is the flight response, whereas fighting the snake is the fight response. So when such a threatful situation appears, as I mentioned, either you can fight the situation or you can fly from the situation. So this particular individual will experience certain physiological changes that gets this person ready to fight or fly. So which are these physiological situations? We already discussed. This could include sweating, dry mouth, tensed muscles, and so on. That would be a panic-stricken situation. There is also increase in blood pressure and pulse rate. We may also breathe heavily, or even the pupils, the eyes will be widened for that matter. Basically, in this moment, the individual's body will transfer the energy from the body systems that are not required to respond to the situation to the body systems that are required to function in order to respond to the situation at hand. There will be some body functions that are to be taken care of. So the energy will move from those areas that are not required at the moment to those areas that are very crucial at the moment. The stimulation of sympathetic nervous system and endocrine system takes place at this moment. So if you were students of biology, you would have studied about CNS, SNS, etc. So the SNS, the sympathetic nervous system and endocrine system takes place at this moment. Stimulation happens. So your text also mentions this example of a snake. That is, if a person suddenly comes across a snake, his or her response would be either of flight or fight, and in this case, his or her body will prepare the person for this situation. How does this preparation happen? There is a disequilibrium that disturbs the homeostasis of the body when the snake appears. When a threat appears, there will be kind of a disequilibrium. Once the situation is over and there are no more challenges or threats, everything will be back to normal. That is, the homeostasis will be restored. So the physiological changes taking place in fight or flight response have to be discussed and understood. For that matter, they have given you a diagram. Figure 2.1 discusses the physiological changes during fight or flight response. Threatening situation appears, then the hypothalamus, it is a part of the brain, I hope you remember. Then there will be action from SNS and there will be action from endocrine system. SNS would lead to the stimulation of adrenal gland. Then a hormone is released and it leads to increased blood pressure or pulse rate and rapid breathing. What happens with the stimulation of the endocrine system? The pituitary gland become active. The corticosteroid releases leading to energy increase and swelling takes place, or very often it is also inhibited. So remember to have an understanding regarding this diagram, because when we refer to the previous question paper, make sure that you do watch that video of the question paper analysis of December 2021 TEE. There they asked us to provide suitable diagrams as well. I suppose you saw that question. So they often ask you to substantiate with the help of diagrams. So this is the diagram that they are referring to. Whenever it is related to fight or flight response, this is the diagram. Basically, you will have to mention the threatening situation and the physiological changes and its consequences. That's all. And plan your writing in order to accommodate the diagram as well. So this is the basis of fight or flight response. Basically, when a threat presents itself before us, we can either fight it or flight response. But whatever may be the choice, whatever may be the response, whenever such a threat happens, there takes place some bodily changes, mainly due to the stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system and the endocrine system. Hence, there will be some hormones released, or there will be some chemical changes in the body. Nevertheless, everything will go back to normal and the situation, the homeostasis will be restored once the threatful condition is under control. Once the snake goes, everything will be back to normal with respect to that particular example. So is the concept clear? General adaptation syndrome. So if we move on to the next one, that is the general adaptation syndrome, it was also part of the December 21 TEE. So if it was Cannon who put forth the fight or flight response, who was the one who put forth the GAS model? Hans Selye. So we also studied this person during the introductory session. I hope you remember the definition put forth by this person. Alright, so Hans Selye also put forth 3 stages that are experienced by an individual when he or she is in a situation that is stressful. Stage 1 is the stage of alarm reaction. Stage 2 is the stage of resistance. And stage 3 is the stage of exhaustion. So let's now move on to stage 1 of GAS model. So more or less this stage is similar to the fight or flight response that we already discussed. Yeah, we can say that during this stage the nervous system, that is the autonomic nervous system, along with the endocrine system, gets activated by the hypothalamus. So what happens is that certain chemicals are released by the adrenaline glands. Which are these chemicals? These include epinephrine and norepinephrine. So you might have to remember the names of these. So this can be termed as a counter shock. Why does this happen? The defense mechanism of an individual gets activated, and it is because of this defense mechanism and its activation that enlargement of adrenocortical happens, and this leads to the discharge of adrenaline, and due to production of adrenaline there happens an increase in functions related to respiration and cardiovascular activity. So there could be high breathing rates, or there could be high heartbeats, etc. All these are because of these defense mechanisms that get activated. So similar to the fight or flight response, our body gets prepared to face the threatening situation. We already studied how that happens in the previous model. There is also increase in energy production. That is the result of the cortisol that is produced by adrenal glands. So adrenal glands are stimulated by ACTH. What is the full form of ACTH? Adrenocorticotropic hormone. This is released by the pituitary gland. Similar to the fight or flight response, here the energy gets transferred to the areas that require more energy at the moment. So functions related to digestion, immune system, and even reproductive system do not receive any energy during this stage. Why is that so? Because energy gets transferred to those areas that need more energy at the moment. It is because of that certain activities become more or less unproductive, or they don't receive much energy during this stage. If this question is being asked, you might have to mention all the terms mentioned here, even that biology related medical or chemical terms that they have used. You might have to mention all these if this question is being asked. Shall we move on to stage 2? Now stage 2 is related to resistance, that is the adaptation is maximum and the equilibrium is restored in this stage. There is an adaptation on the part of the individual, and this individual will resist the stimuli that create stress, and through this resistance what happens? A lot of energy will be needed. If the stress is still experienced and the defense mechanisms are inactive, then the individual will experience the third and last stage. The duration of the stage will depend on the nature, degree and intensity of stressor that the individual is exposed to. That is one thing to take care of. That is, whatever the case may be, it all depends on the nature, degree and intensity of stressor. So if we discuss stage 2, we can understand that here resistance is what is of great importance. That is, adaptation is maximum and the equilibrium is kind of restored. There is an adaptation on the part of the individual. As a consequence, the individual will resist the stimuli that create stress. We can also understand that during this stage, this person, the individual, will need a lot of energy. Therefore, the non-essential functions like reproductive system or digestive system, those systems might not work because energy gets transferred to those systems that are in action at the moment. That is why these systems might not work, and as a consequence there will be changes in the body. There will be physiological changes. Which are these changes? You can always remember there will be change in pulse rate, there will be change in blood pressure. Remember, all these are harmful for the individual and his or her health condition. But these activities happen in order to maintain the balance or the equilibrium. Another important fact to remember is that the duration of the stage will depend on the nature, degree and intensity of the stressor that the individual is exposed to at the moment. Alright, so if the stress is still experienced and the defense mechanisms are inactive, then this person will experience the third and last stage, that is the stage of exhaustion. So moving on to stage 3, here if this person, if in case he or she is experiencing exhaustion, what happens? There will be a collapse of adaptive mechanisms. So as a result of this collapse, what happens? This exhaustion will take place, and this will result in a decrease in the physiological resources as well. So when an individual experiences stress for a long period of time, this can happen. That is, there could be depletion in the physiological resources of the person, and this will certainly have a negative impact on the health of the individual. Alright, so this can result in various health related issues as well. Researches carried out later on stress indicated contrary results with regard to the release of hormones as stated by Sale. That's also mentioned in the text. The post researches and its outcomes is discussed there. The researchers indicated that the release of certain hormones may differ based on the nature and intensity of emotions experienced by the individual. So the nature and intensity of emotions also become another aspect or criteria there. So the difference may exist in the physiological reactions and changes based on the stressor. The duration of exposure to the stressor may also play a role, which is mentioned. And now comes a discussion on acute and chronic stress. We already had a talk on that. That is, what is acute stress? The time period would be very small, alright, but it can also be intense. The examples, a few examples we already discussed. In the text also they were given the example of an interview or an examination. Chronic stress would definitely last for a longer duration, and it can have detrimental effect on the individual experiencing such a stress. Examples could be violent relationships, then workload, etc. So stages in GAS. See figure 2.2. As I mentioned, it is important. Perceived stress leads to alarm reaction, which further causes resistance and can also lead to exhaustion. That is an easy figure. All of you must be able to draw that. It is basically stress and then the 3 stages of GAS. Do you follow me? So from the TEE perspective, it would be of great importance if you could read and understand this unit, because in our day-to-day life this is what actually happens to all of us, right? Now let's move on to the next model, which is titled Cognitive Appraisal Model. So this is put forth by Lazarus and his colleagues. We already looked at Lazarus and his definition of stress. I believe you remember that. So he was of the opinion that stress occurs as a result of an interaction between environment and the individual. He stated that individual differences exist in the way in which the cognitive appraisal is carried out. Remember, this term cognition denotes various mental processes which include reasoning, attention, thinking, perception, memory, problem solving, and even creativity. So he stated that individual differences exist in the way in which such activities are carried out. So this particular model, that is the cognitive appraisal model, states that as the individual faces a stressful situation, they carry out appraisal of the situation in terms of primary appraisal and secondary appraisal. Now we need to know what is primary and what is secondary appraisal. So primary appraisal is done on the basis of the negative effect of stress on the physical and psychological aspects of the individual. So it affects the physical and psychological aspects, whereas secondary appraisal is done on the basis of whether the individual possesses adequate resources to deal with the stressful situation, whether the person is capable enough with the essential resources to avoid stress and its negative effects. Thus, as proposed by this model, the reaction of an individual, may that be physiological, psychological, behavioral or affective, it all depends on both primary and secondary appraisal. That is the effect of stress on physical or psychological aspects, and also whether this individual possesses the necessary resources to tackle this stress. So this is what we call the cognitive appraisal model. You can see figure 2.3 on page number 31. That is also of importance. You might have to learn and try to draw this as part of your answer for your TE. That would probably be a 10-mark question. So the possible question would either be, TAs would be the question they will be asking. Very often we see them combining two things and asking it as if a separate question. Mark will be divided on the basis of that as well. So you can expect any other theory also for that matter. Alright, so you just have to learn diagrams for the first three models. Have you actually drawn diagrams for your assignments? Yes, good, very good. So let's now move on to person environment fit model, PEF.